So now I know that it's working, I think. Can you please add to the chat if you can hear it? Good to go. Okay, great. So sorry. Yeah. And so again, next slide, please. So I will give you a quick review of the webinar. Marta, next slide, please. Thank you. So the webinar will be 90 minutes long, and we are in the brief opening, and then Roberto will moderate the panel with 2 experiences with NEB with Peru and Guatemala, and then we will have a Q&A section for you available. Then Florencia will be the moderator of another session of Beyond MEP with an focus of social sexual health and a view of collaboration with an MBB, inclusive MBB in defining values. And then lastly, we'll have a segment for Q&As. And please use your chat, as you well know, to tell us about your functions and your organizations, and the Q&A for panel questions. And we are recording in both languages. Hopefully they are working. Next slide, please. Before we kick off, I would like to ask you something. What is it that you most need to know about MVP? Maybe you have some ideas already, and for those of you who do have an idea, maybe you can fill out the survey that we added to the chat. And for those of you that don't have a very solid idea, maybe you can think about it and we can come back to the survey at the end of the event. And now I will give you over to Roberto Martinez. Yes, good morning. Thank you so much. And yeah, so first of all, I'm thankful to see all of the colleagues of the different regions and your own regions. And so hopefully this space will be useful for all of you, and really focusing in on the subject matter. We want to talk about experiences of a couple of different countries in the minimum expenditure basket, and in the first part, we want to even go a little beyond, but not just the minimum expenditure, but also look at the lessons learned. And it's a process that we have seen in all of the countries in the region with their particularities and the different contexts, and very linked to the coordination efforts of each country. But we think that they have some very similar guidelines, and that they can take advantage of each other, and the involving all the different parts and moving parts, and incorporating the data and the government, but always keeping in mind the context. And we know that right now it's a very crucial time, even though these exercises have already been carried out. It's still important, and they are being mentioned to them, but that they need to be updated, or perhaps with more frequency, because of the contextual reality, volatility and uncertainty globally that affects, of course, the region. In other regions, it seems like it's a little quicker, the impact and the volatility, but we consider that that is reaching the region, and it's the most appropriate time to share and to create this exchange of experiences, and hopefully it will be useful for your daily responsibilities. And down the road, we of course are at your disposal to be able to clear up any details. And so I will turn you over to Johan, who talked about cash transfers, in the area of cash transfers, and currently he is in Peru, and who has had the experience of having this exercise with the Peruvian group, and within the context of the crisis especially with the Venezuelan personnel, and we wanted to add the variety of South America and what they're experiencing in South America and Central America. I am going to throw out a question and create a context to give it a base. It's a very interesting experience that they have had in Peru. And especially, it's been very interesting, the adaptation to the vulnerable groups and the migratory population and the stable population. I don't know if you can make part of the presentation along those lines or answering that area to create that distinction if those lessons learned. Duarte? Thank you so much, Roberto, and good morning to you all. Pleasure to be with you. And yes, so like Roberto was mentioning, in Peru, it's in order we have used the MEB in order to reach our the transfer value. So quickly, I will explain the trajectory to establishing MEB and to the arriving the transfer and talk about the lessons learned. A little context would be that the CVA in Peru is minimum expenditure basket for the refugee in the Venezuelan population, and this exercise has been created within the context of this project. And so we are going to start with the first step, MEB. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so in November 2020, the decision is made with the work group of cash transfers in Peru to carry out an exercise of building the minimum expenditure basket for migratory families. And before that, the cash values, the transfers were aligned with we were needed to understand a little bit better the needs and the cost of the minimum expenditure basket for the migratory population. So we carried out this. It's been a collaboration with all the different moving with individuals in cash transfers in Peru. And it had a fairly interesting focus, a strong interest within all the members, and the challenges in building this minimum expenditure basket has been really the time that we had, because we had a very small window of time to really create our proposal for the project based on a common basket with all the different participants, and that has been with the data collection of the primary data, and that has been the result of our exercise of creating the MEB, like you can see on the screen. MEB that we have in Peru is disaggregated with education and transportation, communication, and wash and footwear and services and food and nutrition, and it keeps in mind population that's walking and migratory. And that has been really the shift for us in order to be able to really calculate transfer value that is based in common MEB with all the different individuals. So we have MEB, and the next slide, please. Once we had MEB, a little further down. Thank you. Now that we have MEB, really, in order to be able to reach the transfer value, we need to ask you what components of MEB did we need to cover. There's several different components, and like I mentioned, the objective really of the project was to support the migratory population and cover their basic nutritional needs. And so the focus of the exercise was in the food. And and then understanding what the monthly cost for a migratory household in order to cover its basic needs. As far as food goes, we need to consider as well what the resources are that they have at their disposal in the first step of our an analysis of the gap analysis. And so vulnerability in previous projects, we had compiled two data points that were essential in our gap analysis. And like you can see in orange, the monthly income that these families have at their disposals, and then second, how much do they spend in food. You can see in this small, the median disaggregated of income, and there's three methodologies that we have looked into to really identify how we would create this gap analysis. And the first one is understand how much does the basket, the food basket costs per minute, and then have a median income, and that gives us one gap. And we haven't chosen this methodology because this method only really focuses in on the food basket, calculating the gap, and this method is a little more appropriate if next to food assistance, those beneficiaries will receive also complementary assistance in order to cover the other components. So it seemed to me that the gap that we were going to calculate here, it really wasn't going to give us an understanding, a true understanding of what the needs are and what the costs were they needed to sustain to cover the food basket. And the second method was fairly similar to the first in the sense that it really focused, is zeroed in on the monthly food expenditure, but the difference would be that that MEB data, we instead would take it from our own personal surveys. And so in that sense, it wasn't really helping us to really understand the whole gap. And the method with which we have been using has really been the last one that considers the totality of the monthly cost of the MEB, all the, and what the true income is of each beneficiary, and it gives us the monthly gap, the total monthly gap. Next slide, please. And so then once we have all of those data points, we can calculate perhaps the gap. And so we will take the example of three families. The minimum expendable basket is 560, and here it is, we don't use it.
We don't use it for to calculate the actual gap, the methodology, like you see it at the right-hand side, the cost of the total basic food basket, which calculates the basic food needs and the non-food needs that you can see here in green of 1,379 soles. Will help us calculate the median income for three people that you can see here in orange, which is of 600 soles. So with that calculation, we can talk about a gap, expenses and income of minus 779 soles. So the question that we have to ask now is, okay, we have this gap, but what percentage of this gap do we need to cover? The rule that we used was that if the gap is larger than the food basket, then we should cover 100% of the food basket. Why? Because that assumes that with the level of income of 600 soles for three people, if we tried to cover all of their non-food needs, they end up with zero to be able to cover their food needs as established. So in that way, we decided to cover 100% of their food basket. And that was our our actual transfer value. What you can see here on the left-hand side, although we are providing 100% of the food basket, there is a post post-transfer gap of 219 soles. That for me is an alert that we need to consider in terms of a cash focused or oriented model. In the framework of this project, we have parameters uh, where the cash assistance wasn't feasible. And so that's how our transfer rate was calculated. Now we can see what the limitations have been. Next slide, please. Okay, first, we took a definition, very close cut. Uh, we calculated the cost of the food basket. We know that there are other components that contribute between foods to food safety. So that was a lesson learned for us in this new project. Now we are including also the hygiene kits, kitchen utensils, food access costs, and sorry, water access costs, and that has been a lesson learned. The second limitation is the fact that the income that we have evaluated, the rate on the medium Venezuelan income that we've evaluated, that we created it from a vulnerability survey, and we know that when a vulnerability service takes place to evaluate the eligibility of a home to be included in a project, you are measuring more than just the income to ratio towards the probability of being able to be included. So that's the limitation that needs to be noted. Third limitation was the fact that what we have even though we have MEB in common, the gap measurement was internal. We did it with our internal data, and in that sense, even though we have the MEB, the transfer amounts have not been harmonized. And so with this new project, we've coordinated with other actors of the actual PTMs and with other groups that are doing cash transfers. And so now we have a harmonized amount between us and amongst us. The last limitation is that the MEB was built but at the end of 2020, but with now the exchange rate and local prices have changed. So in the actual context of the project, a decision to compensate the evolution of the exchange rate was voted. Now that we have harmonized models between all the actors that are doing cash transfers for food, the next step with that group is to identify how should we monitor the local markets to be able to make a joint decision so that this can reflect our decisions. This has been our experience, and with the use of the MEB to cover this gap and to arrive to a transfer value. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm here for any question.
Muchísimas gracias, Joan.
Thank you, Joan, so very much. Very interesting.
Digamos, muy enfocada a un contexto y unas necesidades
a
muy
presentation
específicas.
very well focused to a context and very specific needs. We begin to enhance the menu from a technical audience to a more extensive audience. This is like more of a general. If you have a question like you doing in chat, we are welcoming. I think we have a 10-minute 10-minute time for Q&As, and also we are open to bilateral communication later. So I encourage you to continue to ask your questions. And after this presentation, we will do a 10-minute Q&A. We will precisely continue to enhance this menu with a presentation from our Guatemala people, colleagues, who were Mauricio Guarica is going to support, who is the food World Food Program coordinator. He's a doctor in sociology, and he's specifically focused on market analysis, which is what was being mentioned towards the end. And I was also mentioning at the beginning how this we will be adapting it and making it as agile as possible to be able to be updated in the volatility situation that we're all living in. So in this case, I think that the difference, especially in the sources, different in its experience, that are less secondary than in the case of Peru. And there's also a case to be made in terms of the governmental actors, and to keep as a reference point numbers or studies that are already in place. So if we could orient the presentation in that line, we would appreciate it. And here's the mic. Roberto, thank you very much. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure presenting the gap calculation that we have done, which please next slide, please, so that we can elaborate the experience a little bit. What you're seeing here on screen is basically how we dimension this. One of the big things here is how to calculate a gap regarding food using analysis, and that's because there's certain data that we weren't achieving, and in that sense to appropriate it with the actual database as respect to the food. And we compared this from 16 to 22 departments in Guatemala, and we're doing updates and upgrades constantly. So each of these help us with corporate indicators for the FEST, or food consumption and food expenditure score, and how to actually determine the actual expense. We talk about the food expense to 100 and 180 days, known as non-food items. In that sense, the composition of the expense, and then what we did was to actually polish it. Why? Because we wanted in a certain way to take that information that could actually tint the gap, and to actually incorporate our own data from a non-food and from a food point of view. That's something that we did at an internal level. Under the production, we went to two sources. FAO has a study about the Guatemala production, which has a few years now out there, but it helped us with efforts to be able to provide certain inflationary cost and calculation, and for them to be econometric in certain aspect, to be able to compare them with the meta population and the sense of what is said. And in that aspect, what we did was we calculated the productions. Why? Because we have the expense. If we only took the expense, we would actually invisibilize the production. There's those who suppose production, but then they sell this in another expense. So let's say $40, because it's a general public. I'm going to use dollars, and then we need to add the food complements. That was our that was largest concern, and this was the way we were able to resolve it. And then we needed to calculate the distance between our data, which include expense, production, and to see what the actual food basket, basic food basket is, which the National Statistic Institute calculates, which is 200 calories, which is in synchronicity with the INCAMP, one of the most prestigious institutes in Latin America. For that, if we could go to the next slide, please. Um, we're gonna we're gonna talk about this now, please. Thank you. So this is where we started to take each data, a deep piece of information. You have the part of income. We would take the actual food cost, the NFI 30 and the NFI 180, so that it gave us a total, so that we could arrive to the actual 7.6 exchange rate. And then we took it to an actual food cost and started to say what the total cost was. Next slide, please. So to determine products like we had done, that was a way. Please continue. What we did was calculate the actual um, uh, agricultural cost for small agricultures, adapting it to the actual inflation rate, and then we took from the Statistics Institute who or which were the homes that needed assistance, which is homes that are most vulnerable from the Statistic Institute, determined the production of consumption per family. We did it per month, per day, and per person. It is important to know that we did this at a mean and at a median level. Next slide, please. In this case, to conclude, what we did was we established, like we had said, with a basic food basket that had 12,000 calories if was approved by the government and that had quality and how it was composed. And for that, I'd like to present the basket. Next slide, please. This is the basic food baskets. It's the 34 products, each with their ponderation for five. It's done for a family of 5 people. And in this case, it's against what we were comparing. What's the result? Next slide, please. This is the result. We have a total cost of 0.84, a production of 0.52, which is an expense and production in the population that we're considering of 1.36. Next slide. This is of course per day. And in this case, what we did was we averaged the daily cost, compared it with the basic food basket and a actual gap daily per person. What we can see is the actual gap, the food gap per person is $155.42 or 1,150.13 local currency. And so what happens from here on? We will be doing an effort to be able to adapt this per sectors, and it's going to be led by PMA and for us, by us, in the form of a workshop to exchange practical experience with the actual cash assistance and food assistance, and then adapting it to the government, because we have calculated this to be able to perform an analysis like the previous one, which goes from the gap forward. And so this is an approach to be able to feed the gap. And then towards the end of July, we will work with a focus group centered in discussing this and sharing experiences to see how we can construct MEBs with different methodologies. So that's where I finish. I appreciate your attention again. I'm here for any question. I don't know if it's now or later.
Mauricio,
Thank you
creo
very
que
much,
también
Mauricio. I think uh, varying and getting out of our comfort zone when it's not from the region. We're a lot of times centered in a very concrete population. I hope I hope that this succeeds. Also, keeping in mind that there's been work on a very specific case in terms of food. Um, the factors are there and are being taken into account to calculate a more ample gap, and in any case it was able to be used. for something else like the next session. And we also see that there are a lot of questions here, and we're not going to be able to reply to all of them because of a time constraint, but we're committed to reply to them via email or later on, and we're going to do a selection now of of so for the space of A for B, of course, what has been taken into account, it's been something that has taken other countries into account, and within a group of cash transfers for different groups and for food safety in other cases where the the entire group is calculated. So I'm going to ask if any of my partners have been able to prioritize the questions so that our panelists can reply to them.
Joan, ¿quieres responder alguna en concreto?
Do you want to reply to one of these specific one? Sure. All right.
Una que me parecía interesante, de repente es algo que
I saw some very interesting questions there.
menciona, es que este ejercicio ha sido hecho realmente para, digamos, población en
This
estadía.
exercise, I've actually did it with a population, with a migrant population that is already established in certain years, that all of a sudden has a job, even though it's informal. So in the sense, let's say, of migrant communities, which is highly mobile, they don't have an income source. And so in that sense,
No consideramos
we don't consider the level of income to be able to calculate the transfers. So we have a cash transfer value for general population and a different one for the migrants. And to my English audience, I apologize. It is very difficult to hear specifically what he's saying and to tell the words apart. Thank you for your patience. There's a lot of background noise. So that is the strategy that we have to be able to work with both the migrant and the stadia population. Also, something that has happened is that we don't have MEP data that is precise for this type of help. And I'm going to give you an example. The basket, the food basket that we have is the one that takes the food items into account that we can find in supermarkets, fresh, red meat, etc.
En supermercados, van a ir a restaurantes, van a
In
ir
order to go to restaurants or to go buy food that's ready to go, as it were. And so there is a lack of alignment between the basket for the migratory and the one that's stationary. What we've done to compensate is include a few other spending like fuel, not for cooking, but for transport. It's not something that necessarily will be the walking migratory population will use, but we use to compensate the fact that we know that the prices of the cost of the minimum expenditure basket for the walking population is higher than the stationary population. And I'm looking to see, yeah, maybe it could be for, yeah, sorry, Johan. And so there's some monitoring of the local markets and their prices and the updating and the mechanisms. And so I don't know if it's the same, leaving the Mauricio the open opportunity to share, but also you, if you have anything to add. Yeah, I mean, in this case, for the price monitoring, what we have done is we have started elaborating in conjunction with the government data. They have a monitoring as far as certain products, But the next step would be the creation of an MFI or marketing functionality index in order to determine and complement this, which expresses the important vulnerability, especially like the times that we're living through, which I think will be a constant in the countries that are watching us and listening in, that are, and it's inflationary in nature, and in the price comparing and in the basket with its own prices, and we have created that gap within a point in time, given the fact that it changes gradually. I don't know if Johan, you have a different experience. Thanks, Mauricio. Perhaps to complement to what you're saying, I think we also use national sources and price monitoring from the government itself. And I would say that something else that we need to do is create a protocol of a following and follow through of the market with all the other agencies, because if
locales y que se toma
a hike in the local prices and you make the decision of reassess the cash transfer values, and we have the modeling and the values of the transfers that are created between different participants. And so if they raise, but Civic Children doesn't, or one network does and not the other, we don't have this sort of harmonization. And so we are really having to create a monitoring strategy of the prices.
Muchas gracias, Joan. No sé. Bueno,
thank you so much, Johan. And what we were saying, we need to answer the question and that are out there. And if you want to contact us on the side or bilaterally, I think that these have to do with the next part of the webinar, which is beyond this. And so now I will let Flor take over, and thank you so much for your participation as panelists and everyone else that have been asking the questions. Let's keep it up. Thank you. Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you so much, Johan and Mauricio, and the MBA and all the examples and the participants and examples, and they complement very well with the next section, which is beyond MEB. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the subjects that usually aren't touched by the minimum expenditure basket, or the minimum cost that they need to secure in order to have their styles of life during emergency. And so we are going to look at these subject matters, which are sectorial in nature, and something that has already come up. And it's MIB is a and let's look at the sector angle, and that can be considered in an expenditure basket, and specific sectors, and health areas and hygiene, and we have to consider the gender issue, and how can we include sectorial or gender and through the minimum expenditure basket. And I would like to invite Cecilia Tamajo Jaramillo, and she's a doctor in medicine and general surgery, mastery in health administration since 2017. She works in Care Ecuador in Sociedades Saludables y Empoderadas, Empowered and Healthy Societies, and she contributed to the HIV response and the COVID-19, and will tell us a little bit about her experience in the visualizations and conceptualization of costs of health and sexuality. All yours, Cecilia. Hello, thank you so much for the space, and we can continue to the next slide. And to tell you that we applied in 2019 meta-analysis, quick gender analysis that we apply in situations of need and crisis and high need, and this is this health section and sexual health and sexual rights and reproductive and WASH and others as well. And in the sexual health and in 2019, which was applied for the crisis of the Venezuelan population in Ecuador, identified lack of access of there's a 25% of people that knew about but very few had access to them, non-planned as a consequence, and 5% of the women interviewed without prenatal and access to the contraceptive and prenatal or delayed increment in 18 of sexually transmitted disease and 18 of men without being treated for from their countries of origin. And on top of that, there were other problems, violence and sexual violence and sexual exploitation, transactional sex without protection, and then the coordination and the local for the response, and then there were individuals for CVA without access of, and we identified that 69% of women, they needed health care, but 89% couldn't access it, and that the same other sexual of LGBT. So the program of monetary of cash transfers is the program through vouchers in order to address health issues and identify the identified gaps in vulnerability populations and in the frame of sexual rights and free and reduce and death, maternal death, and early diagnosis, including the HIV and the nexus with HIV and survivors of sexual violence and the link with services of the health and the complement of attention based on gender and protection. The program was implemented a first phase in 2019 when we started creating the program from August of 2020, and then a phase that I could say major consolidation and has had adjustment depending on the reality that we have had in the territory. We can continue. What's the population that participates in this program? Are refugees, migrants, immigrants, and people vulnerable that are in reproductive ages, teenagers, and survivorship based on violence, and mothers that are breastfeeding, including teenagers and people living with HIV and people and LGBTQ populations. How do we define the cost and the procedure of this sort of assistance through vouchers? And so the operation processes are defined and they contain the detail of what is covered, what population it can access, and the amounts that can be covered with each voucher. And taking into consideration the Department of Health guidelines, what expenditure is allowable, what isn't, and the basic medication. And this defines the package that can be implemented for each situation. Then a list is created for services to be hired from vendors and labs that complement the work, medications, and medical supplies, and some of the for the first phase, when we had no doctors, the first approach was through the Ministry of Health, and we it was selected in the different bidding and of the cost that has different territorial differences. And once selected, the coordination process and sensibilization of the providers and to attention to the population that is participating in this program. And we have done adjustment based on the locality and the needs of the population. And once defined, an agreement is signed of services rendered, and there is an instructional based on the standard practice to define the procedure of attention, voucher reception, and the billing, and that's monthly. And prior to the validation, this process was complemented with other actions that have to do with prevention and detention of violence based on gender. And one of the vouchers is for survivors of domestic violence based on gender and health services, sensibilization in rights for sex and other sorts of transfer in order to provide a more integral service to the population, and the combination with agencies and organizations in the territory. And there's an example here of the vouchers that we have. And one voucher is different pathologies, prioritizing the population in Venezuela and Ecuadorian that are vulnerable. And the first one is more focused in on survivors of domestic violence, and the second voucher for health and reproductive health and sexual health, and the third voucher that has to do with exams and specialized medication that are used for also treating survivors of sexual violence, $50 to $75, another voucher for HIV, and $15 to $20, and contraceptives, $14, and this is complimentary for prevention kits, up to $6. Please continue. And the voucher example, this is for lab exams and medical consults, and the voucher for the item being. And one of those lessons learned is that this was a new program. We didn't find history, and so the program needs to be adapted, and it was based on the population need, and the services that were defined was very harsh for the population. We had to make adjustments, and locally strengthen the access of the population to the services, but also becomes as a mechanism of the public norm and regulations, and it's also necessary the training of the different participants that take care of the refugee and migrant population, and the incorporation and application of the communities and the sectors, health sectors, and the entities need tools in order to be able to offer better information mm, and the implementation of the program. We also need to have um, the refugee and migratory to include the necessary supports, and also we need uh, more integral processes in order, because the health needs are only a part of everything that the population needs. So those are my comments. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cecilia, for this very important information, especially how we can cover. There's a few questions in the chat, so please hold your questions for another panelist that will be complementing and adding to this vision. We will add also questions for Cecilia and the other presenters to focalize and to complement a little bit more. Suni, she's in UNICEF and in waters and hygiene and in Caribbean, and also a representative of WASH in the region, 16 years in WASH and emergencies and development in different regions. And more recently, she has done a very good work in menstrual hygiene. Very happy to be here. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to share the presentation, but no problem. The whole presentation is here. And in May, we are celebrating the day of the menstrual hygiene. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you about WASH and girls and women about this subject and menstruating individuals. And the regional group, WASH and UNICEF, have as a plan mm, 4 priorities and public
Trabajamos en sensibilización y campañas. Trabajamos en generación de evidencia y guía. Y apoyo a entregas de servicios de calidad, ¿no? Y creo que en la región.
And I think that in the region we can collaborate with groups, cash transfers, especially in the last 2 areas, the areas of accumulation of evidence and guidance, in the areas of quality service provision. Before we, I don't know if I can share my screen or not. Can I share? Yeah, we're waiting. You can share, please. Oh, good. Okay. All right, I'll do it now. It won't take that long. And thank you for your patience. I actually have it prepared. I can share. All right, because I already have it here. Can you see it? Yeah, you can see it. Okay, so to be more efficient, I will continue here then. As I was mentioning, these are the 4 areas of the plan. The evidence generation and guidance part and quality service provision are 2 areas that I think have possibilities of collaboration. So in a way, we enter into 3 points that I'd like to share. The first point is the coordination between the WASH sector and the cash transfer sector. And like, the WASH group, I always recommend the leaders of the WASH tables to coordinate in a very tight manner. We've had experiences in Honduras and in other countries.
Y, bueno, más de manera
And
general, a nivel
more in a
global,
general way, at a global level,
fundadora de un grupo global de mercados y
um,
transferencias monetarias do Cluster
uh,
Global de WASH.
as a founder
Para las
of a
nominaciones
cash
de los
transfer group, and as
pagos,
part of the
los
donations that we would have
líderes de WASH o de clusters o de
for all the leaders of the
es
WASH,
una obligación, digamos,
an obligation, so to
los
speak.
coordinadores WASH participen,
The
contribuyan
WASH coordinators
con este
can
sector. Así que les
participate
animo
and
que no solo
coordinate in these sectors. So I want to encourage you to not only come from WASH, but to also coordinate and talk to our colleagues and sectors, and to talk about intersectoral coordination. Also to talk about the opportunities in the region, like I was saying, generation of evidence and guidance, given the priorities of our regional plan. And when we launched a market group with the WASH Global rate, we incorporated a different market. And in this global report, there are not many menstrual hygiene details. What we've seen from the 18 basic food baskets, 15 of the 18 include hygiene costs that represent like 8% of the total cost of the basket. We're talking 8%, with a small group of 18 baskets, right? So what I'm thinking is that costs with hygiene products, they don't vary much from one month to the next, and they don't vary drastically between countries monthly either. But what does change is the number of people maybe at the house, the family composition, and there's more menstruating persons. We've seen that the Gaza basket had more value, 28% of the value, or the amount of the basket, especially when it's about menstrual hygiene. And we have a big gap, which is documented with the menstrual products for menstrual hygiene, and specifically with cash transfers. And we are building a coalition to do a call to more investigations in that aspect. So in this framework, with the gap in evidence for cash transfers in menstrual hygiene, well, I invite you and I want to encourage you so that we can collaborate together between WASH, Clash, and other collaborations, other collabs, so that we can document the experiences and to have data of what we have achieved. And so this is a call to action and opportunity. I spoke about intersectorial coordination and collaboration, considering the gap of evidence that exists. And the last point is a call to guarantee the rights of boys, girls, and menstruating persons. I think it's very important for women and menstruating persons with services that allow them menstrual integrity. And in terms of these elements, let's ensure so that they're not a barrier and that they don't miss school days like we've seen with teenage girls. So it's a matter of rights, but also of dignity, hygiene, and menstrual hygiene. Notwithstanding our humanitarian goals in Latin America, we are leading in this aspect at public policy level. We've seen a law in Brazil now that guarantees the guarantees free menstruating accessories for women and people in a menstruating situation. Also in Ecuador and in Peru, there are projects and legislation, and so this is an area that, well, Latin America and the Caribbean are in the forefront. It's not public policy that are established in several first world countries at all. We also have in some countries, I think Colombia, for example, the tax, the topic where we talk about gratuity and for the students. Well, in any case, in that aspect, with co-humanitarians working in the region, I think that what we can do is achieve and fulfill the standards, and in that aspect, to ensure that children, women, and menstruating people have access to all of this information. The three pillars of a complete program of menstruating dignity. And we're talking about products like cups, towels, tampons, or pads, and between women and men to have capacity, dignity, and aside from that, also the security of good information elements and the destigmatization, or to get the stigma out of it. And my final point would be to work amongst colleagues in the cash transfer sector, but to be able to help the menstruating population and to provide answers in an adapted way. We've seen cases in countries where the menstruating population prefers to receive a product in an in-kind product as opposed to receiving the actual cash transfer, because at a home level, it could be that the actual menstrual products for teenagers is not a priority. So the population actually asks in-kind products. And so in that matter, we invite you to ensure that the hygiene and menstrual integrity products are part of the food basket. Pads, cups, tampons they are fundamental for the guarantee dignity of women, girls, and menstruating people. That said, I think I reached my time, and I appreciate the investigation, and let's continue with this collaboration and looking at the collaborations of these different sections. Thank you very much, Suni. This is very interesting, and I think that it's a really good pitch for the last panelist that we have, especially in this coordination call or call to coordination topic, how we respond to the necessities and the needs of menstruating people, but also the different needs, integrating gender topics, sectorial topics within the calculation of the food basket, and later on with the definition of a monetary transfer, of a cash transfer. Transfer that a lot of times we have to coordinate from different groups. So taking this call, I'd like to invite Lina Camperos. Lina, she works in the Rich office. She has more than 6 years in investigation experience for the humanitarian programming in Latin America, and she's currently in Colombia and leads the cash markets teams for cash transfers at a national level. Lina, I see you're online, and so maybe to pitch your expo, I'd like to ask you, given your experience in this group, what good practices can you tell us about sectorial needs integration in the food baskets and the minimum expenditure baskets? Thank you, Florencia. And yes, very much in line with what Suni just mentioned. So this is just like a little scheme of the exercise that we did in Colombia that we are actually culminating right now in validation stage. This is something for us within the support that Rich has provided in Venezuela from other ways that we will mention in depth, which is like the pillar of the exercise. So what we did was truthfully to that those recommendations with the technical and manual that they can resonate with the construction of the basket and what we want to do in this new proposal. Well, you know, so like they have specific details in Colombia, but basically to start a road with different consultations, like what these experts in each theme were exposing for how to receive the different products and services of the minimum food basket expenditure. And so this led to a lot of challenges, a lot of questions from different sectors. What is a food basket, a minimum food basket? And for all of the other sectors, this became a challenge. And what is the basket? How can people adhere to it? And what is the use and the definition of the transfer, the cash transfer amount and value for the at a sectorial level? This was a several month process. This generated a lot of arguments with each sectors with their own partners or reflections from their own programming, and because all of the programs are inherent to each sector. And so let's say this was like the process that everybody has it in terms of participation and inclusion from each sector in the complete building. And so we can go to the questions that Lisa was proposing. What answers or lack of answers were we arriving to with all the comings and goings of each sector? So what is an MEB? How can that be speaking to us? What can we from our different sectors provide? And a lot of questions also very programmatical. What do we need to include so we have a very specific case here with the perfection case, and Lena also with what Sunny was mentioning, the pillar of protection services, that they need to be accessible by all, and to have a standard conception, like Cecilia was mentioning not long ago. This generated a reflection at an internal level in different sectors and areas. What are those additional expenses that people are incurring and to be able to access for real to their rights under the protection umbrella? So that was very challenging to be able to see how can we afford these things, considering that members were implementing the program with gender violence victims, and to be able to afford all of those additional expenses. And it was like an exercise that was very enriching in the sense that yeah. And then there's more the topic of questions of the kits that were delivered, the multi-sectorial. We have all of the kits that are delivered for migrant communities, and so this starts to form the basket or not. And so that's where we could start to have that conversation to come back to the sectors, to come back anew, afresh, with what are the different topics of the basket. And so that opens the question to Venezuelan topic, for example, like regarding the pause and the cash transfers, the sectorial questions that are very interesting. So like, okay, if we can't do programming, how can we actually talk about vouchers and cash transfer? What is the basket talking about? So what type of monitoring can we apply to the basket if we're interested in it at a retail level or at a wholesale level, because each home ends up covering the humanitarian programming there. And I apologize, my English speakers, this is very fast paced. Venezuelan and Colombian young lady, this is amazing. We open this discussion to the different processes to be able to incorporate it to different sectors like retro feedback, and so we would have some secondary information with some people. It wasn't just official, but it was several sources for the topics of WASH or education, for example, that we might not have in our monitoring, or that would be put in place in Colombia, or for example, with the actual inflation topics for the food topics and that are set in motion. So, and it's like, passing this proposal and making it transparent. It generated intersectorial arguments and discussions. So what would you talk about food safety in terms of wash baskets, and which reflect the intersectorial process that we actually have. So, and the once the basket is culminated and combined with the sectors, it does its rounds. You have provided all this information, so we're going to present and provide the basket directly within the sectors with the partners involved, and how can the basket be used from a programmatic standpoint, and when it comes to vulnerability at a very specific level. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Lina, very much. I grab potential pedagogical role that we could approach from the cash transfer policies, from this coordination and intervention with the sectors, to be able to show the utility of the food basket, even to the degree of generating value for it, and also talking about the holistic basket, which I know previous panelists had mentioned, I think in Joan's expose. And so I think we're accessing the actual Q&A of the webinar. So let's take questions that are in the chat so that we can begin to answer the questions, and so that the questions can be put in the Q&A section. And I'm going to actually talk about a first one. Lina, I'm sure that you can have experiences about this. And I think a little bit about Daniel Pazmiño and what he said in what he put in the chat. And I'm going to share it with you, Daniel. That it has to do with the articulation, other actors and other specific articulations to be able to arrive to the cash transfer value, or amount. I think of the value of the government's social articulation, and to be able to provide room for this topic that was shown in the chat. If maybe you can tell us a little bit of the experience you've had, Lina, with this. And of course, what other panelists would like to compliment.
Thank you, Florencia. In the case of Colombia, it's been since the cash transfer the very active role of the government, and not just but the dialogue that we've been wanting to have with the social protection and specific assistance officially for the Colombian population. And it's been a whole thing with the initial amount and then the renegotiation that we have to have later as far as the amounts and the funds, and it has to work side by side of the Department of Social Protection that has to do with all the matters and the Colombian population, and the team of the Social Protection Agency very actively participating in the definition of the amounts in order to precisely create a dialogue with the entities that receive or have received regularly the Colombian population with certain specific points and focalizations, and differentiate those, how the amounts addressed being able to be received by the Colombian population, how the PTM afforded the governmental entity to define in a harmonious way what the amount really was. So today we have some established amounts and guidelines by the government for the migratory refugee population that homes of 1, 2, 3, or 4 more members, and have also a threshold official that they will comply with. And so for the new negotiation for the amount, a little bit based on the creation of the minimum expenditure basket that our colleagues were talking about, but also it's that previous logic that the government applied, but within the homes, but more informed than at the time. It was not that we didn't have it, but it was different than the way that we had it. In order to have a basket today, we have to address the specific needs of the refugee population. Thank you, Lena. I don't know if you want to have a space. Joanne, Mauricio, have an experience within your transfer groups that participating in Peru and Guatemala with this whole thing about coordinating with the government or establishing this guideline or non-guide alignment. Mauricio, I see that you raised your hand. Yeah, happily. I think, thank you, Florencia. I think we do believe that the union with the government in order for the programs to work, and so the government, in a sense, is one of the most important entities in this process, and it's important to include them and to have this dialogue, and at the same time support them. And we have undergone efforts, support efforts, and training with personnel and with the government as well. In some way, shape, or form, was undernourished with this subject, and it's been growing and been very important for us. And the government and training of government entities. Yes. Thank you, Mauricio. Joanne, thank you. Yes, quickly to complement. I think that we also have what to align, because we also are implementing cash transfers with the objective of complying with basic needs in nutrition. And so if we have to align anything, it's for social transfers to have the same objective. In that sense, like the first cash transfers that we have initiated in Peru at the beginning of 2020, the government also had those funds for the support for the those bonuses and vouchers are gone for, so now we have to systematize lessons learned and that can be utilized to improve emergency response systems and programs like the COVID and expansion horizontally and the focalization of the registry and working with financial support services and providers and like the next steps so that we need to explore and formalize a little bit more. Great. Thank you, Mauricio and Joanne and Lena. And I'm going to take up a question that I think maybe it's more linked to the first session, but thinking that going beyond MEB and the factors that we don't typically consider when we have to talk about the minimum expenditure basket, we can open to the panelists in all sessions. And Alan Grundy or Brandy in the chat added it. He's asking basically about how can we consider preferred cultural consumption when we have an objective in the majority of this preferential cultural preference when having to define the products included in the minimum expenditure basket. Any specific answer from Lena and Joanne? So because of the role that we have, how the development of both minimum expenditure baskets would feed the basket that we were the preference. We also there's a mix in the very beginning. It's basically in rights and the standards. But how in this process, in the preference and in like a hybrid situation, and it was in Venezuela. And that on the one hand, and then there's something that I didn't mention, and I think it's indispensable and crucial in the formation of the minimum expenditure basket. We have the least amount of resources, and we want to include the voices like the PTMs or the surveys or the CVAs, and so I think that in this definition, in the or even before from vertically up down is the qualitative corroborating what the minimum expenditure baskets are and the standards created are really speaking into the communities and the priorities and expenditures within the home. And so that is also along the line of and aligned with the sectors, and the sectors and the standards is a little bit non-negotiable because fortunately in Colombia we have information of market monitoring for rent, and we are what is the right what sort of and how we are talking to the communities and dealing with this situation. Joanne and Suni, briefly, because we are right on top of the end of the our session. Yeah, very quickly, and I think that taking into consideration the CVA, it's been interesting for us and the priorities. We have to consider the reality of the markets and local sector and the services that are within the local sector is something that comes up in our CVA and on the field is that there's no bread or there at the store where I go, and so we have in the creation of the minimum expenditure basket, we have considered the preferences and the reality of the local market, but also accompanying with it the nutritional element so that that migratory population in the country also has information in order to maximize its potential in the nutritional potential of the product and the foods in the local sector and the markets. And so we have a situational case looking into the migratory population, the barriers to access those food products in the local markets, and the knowledge of how to prepare them. And that has been a kind of a hybrid approach, a preference in reconciling the reality of the local markets. Thank you, Joanne. Suni, I see your hand is raised. Yes, thank you, because we're already at the end of our time together, and basically for hygiene, menstrual hygiene, listening and paying attention and taking into consideration the different practices and what's most appropriate. And I also what's available in the market, absolutely. And also in the case of like pads or tampons aren't, for instance, the priority. And if you are considering menstrual cups, also you need to make sure that and diaphragms that it can be utilized, that the cup can be utilized in a way that the cup can be appropriately washed and sanitized, and it goes beyond the consult and what you've done with the infrastructure surrounding that supply. And so thank you. The preferred cultural preference and the reality infrastructure in order to consider what we can do from the minimum expenditure basket and the calculation at the end of it. So sorry, Holly, you have the last word. Thank you for the space. And I also would like to thank you for a super interesting panel and multiple questions, and we will be addressing them with the panelists later. I will take 30 seconds. Please don't forget to fill out the form, because we can create other events and know your needs. Next slide, we're also going to share some of the resources that have to do with the subject in English and Spanish, and a guide and a on behalf of all of the presenters and panelists, thank you for your participation and have a great day. Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much.